Welcome. I am Michele Leclaire, Executive Director of Buckham Gallery. Today, I am chatting with Michael Weigman about his exhibition, Midwest Moonfog Part 2, on view through July 23rd. Additionally, this exhibition may be viewed on our website at buckhamgallery.org. Weigman's work explores his suburban upbringing, fascinations with underground subcultures that were his escape and interest in the industrial era history. These disparate sources clash, creating an abstract mythology used to illustrate his vision of contemporary issues. Weigman employs the printmaking medium due to its legacy as a communicative medium for the working class. Before we join the conversation, I would like to say thank you to our incredible audience, whether visiting the gallery in person or viewing these videos online, and to all the artists who submit to our exhibition calls. I appreciate you. Next, I would like to say thank you to the individuals and organizations who support Buckham Fine Arts Project and Gallery, including Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, the Michigan Arts Culture Council, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Greater Flint Arts Council Share Art Genesee Grant Program made possible by the Genesee County Arts, Education, and Cultural Enrichment Millage Funds. Your tax dollars at work. Thank you. Buckham Gallery is pleased to present Midwest Moonfog Part 2, a solo exhibition featuring work by Michael Weigman, is an artist, printmaker, and educator living in Columbus, Ohio. He received his MFA from Northern Illinois University with a focus in printmaking. Much of Michael's work explores a personal mythos combining elements of his suburban upbringing, obsession with history, and fascinations with subcultures found in extreme metal music. He's exhibited his work both nationally and internationally and has organized art exhibitions in Ohio and surrounding states. Beyond being a practicing artist, he is currently a manager of the print shop Upright Press, a member of the Columbus Printed Art Center, and a freelance illustrator. He also has experience as a faculty member at multiple academic institutions, most recently Ohio State University. Yeah, so I am so excited to be here with Michael Weigman today. So welcome, Michael.
Hello.
I am just thrilled to have this opportunity to chat with you today and share your work with our Flint and digital audiences. Having it here in our space and in Flint, and it was really great meeting you at the opening last month, and so here we are today. So I generally like to start these conversations with a little background information. We like to know who our artists are and really kind of where you're from, and generally speaking, what led you down the path to art making?
Yeah. I was originally born in Toledo, Ohio. So lived in that area for the majority of my life. Grew up in a suburb outside of there called Perrysburg, Ohio, for like my teenage and high school years and stuff. Went to Bowling Green State University for college, originally for the arts, because at the time when I was a kid, I was really kind of into the idea of just drawing on the side, but was never really super serious about it. But my parents were like, you gotta go to college. So I was like, I'm going to college. But at that point, there was a few influences that I had in art making. I was really into like album covers and designs with that. So I did have somewhat of a, influence in that regard. But I didn't get really serious about art making until I found printmaking. And when I was in college, I ended up taking an intro to printmaking course with Janet Ballwig at Bowling Green State University. And I took a course with Janet later on with printmaking, but Joe Duva was my original professor for printmaking there at Bowling Green State University, and really fell in love with the medium and the process of that. And at that point is when I got like fully integrated into, this is what I want to do. I want to be a printmaker. I want to be an artist, and really kind of jumped into it there. After that, went to Northern Illinois University, did my master's in printmaking. And then after that, worked at Ohio State for many years, teaching in their print program. But now currently I'm working in two separate print shops. One of them is called Upright Press, where we do a lot of gig posters and screen printing. And then the other one is Columbus Printed Art Center, which is a community print shop that does a lot of relief printing, intaglio printing, traditional medium of that sort. So I'm able to kind of do both sides of things, the commercial world and the fine art print world.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah. And it's so nice to have like a print shop in a community like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So it was just kind of interesting. You mentioned your parents are like, you're going to college, you know, and everything. Were they supportive when you decided that you wanted to go for art? Like, was your family like all into it?
Yeah, very much so. I feel like they were not as supportive when they found what the imagery became later on in life. And think partially because when I was a kid, I was always really interested in kind of more of the morbid curiosity of things. My parents were always really big on, you know, the fact that I was a creative person and wanted to support that. But when I started getting into like things like heavy metal culture and stuff like that, I think they were always slightly nervous by that. But they were always still supportive of the art making. But I think later on in life, when they've kind of, you know, seen, you know, where it's taken me and where the imagery and like where the influences are coming from and the discussions that I'm having with it, I think that they're much more supportive of it now. But kind of a funny story I like to tell. When I was a kid, I really wanted to get this band called Korn, one of their records. It was really popular in the 90s and stuff. The album was Follow the Leader, I believe was what I was looking for. And it was parental advisory. And my parents were pretty like by the book, like you can't, you know, get the parental advisory albums or whatever. And I remember I was going to a media play, which I don't know if anybody listening here knows what media play is. It's defunct now, but it was a place in Toledo that we would go to get CDs and stuff. And I was with my dad, like about 13, 14 years old, and was like, I want to get, you know, that particular, you know, CD or whatever. And he was like, no, we're not going to buy the parental advisory Korn album or whatever. And I was like, oh, jeez, that stinks. But I look over to the side because it was in the metal section. And right next to it was the cover of Sepultura's Arise album, which Sepultura is this extreme thrash metal band and stuff. But they were much more underground. Well, not underground, but much more kind of off the beaten path compared to Korn. And their album wasn't parental advisory. And I remember I picked that out. I was like, I want this. And the cover was crazy. It's like this brain and this eyeball and this like weird structure underneath and all this stuff. I was like, this is cool. Like visually, this is awesome. Music is awesome. And then when I bought that and I got home and listened to that for the first time, it's way heavier than whatever Korn was. And it was like, like I don't care about Limp Bizkit. I don't care about Korn. Like this is what I care about. I care about Slayer, you know, like Sepultura, like Deicide, all these other bands. So I think when I got into that stuff and they saw that, they were like, oh, geez, this is concerning. But growing up in a small, you know, Midwestern town, I think I was always looking for influences of extreme and kind of looking for some way to get out of my shell. So I think in some ways, like what seemed dangerous actually really made me become a person that I am today and gave me confidence to kind of look for really pushing myself as an artist too.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. And thanks to your dad, he found that.
Yeah, I've loved them ever since.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you actually about your title for the exhibition, Midwest Moonfog Part 2. First of all, about the initial title, but also the Part 2. So 2 parts.
Yeah. So the Midwest Moonfog Part 2, it's a continuation of kind of this work focusing on my upbringing in the Midwest, along with the heavy metal iconography and the industrial influences when it comes to industrial era history. So like World War I, the transforming of kind of the middle class and upper class and leaving the Victorian era. That's all kind of built into the stuff. But it's a continuation in that my first solo show that I did when I was in graduate school was Midwest Moonfog, and it was about that subject matter. And I thought Midwest Moonfog Part 2 would be a good way to kind of continue it because the influences are still rather similar, but the imagery has changed drastically. The first one that I did, the first Midwest Moonfog in grad school, had a lot more comedy in it. I did do a lot of the work then, or that work back then in 2013. So obviously a different world, you know, at that point in time for me socially and politically. And then to like kind of the part two is kind of just to be like, how's it going? You know, like, what does it look like? So not only has my imagery evolved, but my, you know, kind of maybe some of the subjects have become much more complex too within the imagery as well. The Midwest part is, you know, growing up in the suburban Midwest. And then the Moonfog part is a reference to like black metal. So like references to like some of their vocals and stuff they would talk about, you know, like deep in the moonfog, or like talking about the wilderness and stuff, and like the wilderness of the Midwest in my mind, and whatever that could pertain to. But the Moonfog also, I think, is this good resemblance of a personal mythology too. It's this fantastical kind of word to me. So I think that it kind of adds that mystique to it as well. So it's like this Midwestern thing that's very banal, and then this Moonfog thing that's very mysterious. And if you combine that together, I think it kind of gives me the ability to play with the imagery in a way that can have it become this personal mythology kind of thing that's bizarre. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this definitely was, well, I'll start moving to an image. The personal, well, the mythology and is very evident in the work. It was kind of interesting. You mentioned your interest in the industrial age and everything. One of our visitors to the gallery recently mentioned they wondered if the artist had any experience during the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, probably not personal,
no,
but it was kind of interesting because there is this like intense like war. I mean, it definitely comes across as this moments of conflict and strife and like the worst possible moments in history in some way.
Yeah.
Oh. Now, and you've mentioned your interests in like heavy metal, and then I can't remember if it was on your website or not, but you mentioned it, or in your artist statement, extreme metal music, and I was kind of what that meant.
So extreme metal is more of like I kind of equate that to, you know, Black Sabbath is heavy metal. Extreme metal is like Watain and Morbid Angels. So those bands are much more focused in on extreme subject matter. It is a lot of like the worst things in the world happening, you know, like all are kind of like tied into the lyrics. Also very like blasphemous lyrics too and stuff. Not that that's like a big thing for me, but like that's also like kind of wrapped into there as well. But I think it always has this feeling of very destructive qualities about it lyrically. And then the music too, and the sound of it as well is just much more bombastic and fast, or slow and unrelenting, and the volume is way higher too. So extreme metal it's music that, like, if I popped in like I said, like a Black Sabbath album and people listen to it, most people would be like, oh, I can see that's music. But if I pop in a Morbid Angel record, like people are gonna be like, what is this? You know, like, so extreme means only certain people may find it intriguing in some way. So that's, I guess, what extreme metal would be.
Yeah, so you talked about that initial album that you had and the cover art, and then the music being extreme and talking about these, and so I wanted to, how is it influencing your work? But that seems pretty evident. No, I'm sure they're not illustrative of things, but yeah.
But I thought, but also too, like the commentary the visitor had about the Holocaust and stuff, a lot of my artistic influences outside of just the cover art in general, like I'm a huge fan of Kathy Kollwitz, who is a maker from that, you know, World War I, World War II era. Her son died in conflict and stuff, and a lot of her imagery is like heavy emotional stuff. So I think that's weaving its way into like how the visualizations that I'm having. So that's like someone who's grown up in that area when the Holocaust is happening, as a person who's a massive influence on like visually what I look for in printmaking and as an artist and what I've developed into my imagery. Another one would be like Otto Dix, too, the painter Otto Dix. He did a series of etchings called Du Krieg about his experience in World War I as well. And that's a little bit more chaotic in like the mark making and stuff, which that kind of influences my kind of distortion of the way that I draw the figure too. So even though that I am drawing like realistic images, there are certain proportion things and stuff that I play with a little bit to add more intensity to certain areas. For instance, the print image that's on the screen here, we tarnish our roots with our ignorance. The figures kind of moving their hands down and stuff, those are elongated from like source images that I've taken, and the fact that the guy's face is kind of blinded and stuff too. Those are kind of connections to like my fascinations with artists like Otto Dix, who kind of like really distort reality in that way. And then another one too, who's more of a recent artist that really influences me visually and the broodingness of the imagery would be someone like Sue Ko. She's a good illustrator drawing, but also too does a bunch of lithographs, and her lithographs have that kind of similar look to it as well, the brooding nature of that. So I think those three kind of pillars of my influences really kind of play a role into like how it visually is represented, but then also too the fact that I'm adding in this industrial era imagery as well, to kind of showcase this idea of, you know, the transformation of the industrial era from Victorian to industrial. A lot of those issues that we had back then are still very permeated in our culture today, but at the same time, it's suppressed in certain areas because we don't fully investigate certain things. But thanks to the internet and stuff, like we're maybe seeing more, and also no thanks to the internet because we're now getting misinformation. But I think that those combinations maybe give that representation of that it looks like it's from somebody with those experiences.
Yeah. Well, before we go too much further, I thought maybe you could, for those in our audience who are maybe not familiar with printmaking medium, if you would just give like a brief description of intaglio and serigraphy, which is also screen printing, right? That's the fancy name. Yeah. Yeah. Because, you know, not everyone is familiar with these processes. So.
Yeah. So with, I guess to start with screen printing and serigraphy first, that is a process of using a polyester mesh screen. So it's a screen that has a bunch of tiny little holes in it. And it's usually made out of polyester. And that is adhered to a frame that is made out of aluminum or wood, something like that. And it's pulled taut. And what is done with that polyester mesh is there is a stencil that is put onto it. It can be painted on, it can be exposed on with emulsion. I use emulsion for mine, but basically the stencil creates an image on the screen, and everywhere that's covered is blocking where ink can pass through. Everywhere that is not, ink can pass through. So the idea is that like you make your image on the screen, and then you can take what's called a squeegee, which is this basically this piece of metal that has like rubber on it at the bottom or something similar to that. And you're able to push ink through the screen to get your image. And you can do that as many times as you want until the ink dries out or something like that. So that's kind of how screen printing works. Intaglio printing, so I use KM plates for my intaglio printing. It's called photogravure as well. It requires exposures and stuff. But the actual printing process for that, it's a plate that's either made out of copper or some thick material that can be carved into. And you can carve into the material with like usually very fine tools to get very fine line marks and things like that. So you draw your image with whatever tools you have that will make impressions onto this piece of either copper or whatever the matrix is in this case. And you can take ink and push it into those grooves that you created. Once you're done pushing into those grooves, you polish the surface off with things like a tarlatan, or you can use phone book paper to kind of paper wipe it down. So you basically polish that entire surface off, but you leave the ink in those grooves, and then you're able to run that plate through the press, and it will pull the ink out of those grooves onto the sheet of paper that you put over your plate, causing that to make a ink impression onto your page. And you can do that, you know, hundreds and thousands of times as long as you take care of the plate, you know, as you're running it through the press. Intaglio processes take way more time than screen printing because of the fact that you're having to push ink into the plate and polish it off and stuff. But the amount of information you can get from those images is, I think, way more intricate than what you get with screen printing. But that being said, screen printing has an immediacy to it, as well as a certain quality when it comes to using color and stuff that's hard to match as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, I love talking about the different printmaking methods, not just because I've been printmaking myself, but because but
Like, it's a
because
good nerd out about, yeah, for sure.
it is. But I feel like when people think of like prints, sometimes they think of, easy access, cheap, just high quantity process things. And it's such a hands-on, handmade, you know, art object also, and there is so much involved in the hand printing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyways, I just think it's important to
Yeah.
educate people.
Well, and it's something too that, was a trade for years. And that's interesting too with some of the influences I have with the industrial era stuff. Because like back then, like these processes were, how people would create the images for newspaper and stuff, like typesetting with letterpress, and all that stuff.
Mhm.
It's this, in some ways, it's this, medium for the masses, but in other ways, there's a time consuming and a craft that you have to understand in order to be able to produce it correctly. And and there's also a difference too. Like you print something out on a large format printer and stuff, like, and you look at the ink on there, it's going to look one way, but then if you screen print that or you make it in Intaglio or a lithograph or something like that, the ink stands up on the page, in a different way. And there's those small differences too that maybe some people won't notice it initially at first, but when you do, it's really hard to kind of like not look at those hand pulled prints as something that have a special, look or appearance to them, as well as the labor that goes into it.
Yeah. And I'd love to hear more about these, like, I don't remember what you would call it, the photo polyester plates?
Polymer plates and stuff. Yeah, it's kind of, it's a process. So I used to make a lot more lithographs, especially when I was teaching at Ohio State and when I was at Northern Illinois for graduate school. Lithography was always a medium that I was really, really excited by and stuff, because the way I draw, it kind of matched up with, working on stone and junk. But afterwards, I decided to kind of move into more of these photopolymer plates, because they allow me to, number one, work on imagery in a way that I'm not having to protect it like a stone you're having to protect from grease pigment and such. But with the photopolymer plates, I'm usually drawing on a piece of frosted mylar, which is this transparency that has this frost texture to it that's able to hold pigment. And I'm usually using like a Prismacolor pencil to sit there and draw onto this and get all this nice detail and really build up an image. And then from there, I'm able to take that piece of frosted mylar and expose it onto these photopolymer plates. Photopolymer plates are typically, they can either be like a KM plate or which is what I usually use, or a solar plate, which is one that's pretty popular that I used a bit in graduate school. But the idea with these plates is they have a steel backing to them, and then they usually have a coating on top that's either made of like an emulsified surface or something that's able to be responsive to light. But those plates are kept in the dark, but then when you're ready to expose them, you can take them to an exposure unit, take your image that you have that you're going to expose onto your plate, and you can expose it onto your plate. And the nice thing about these plates is they're processed with water and not other chemicals. So it's relatively non-toxic. And that's something that for me, as I get older, is really impactful, because, a lot of printmakers, when we're using, especially in lithography and stuff, you're using things like, acid, like nitric acid and all these other things, asphaltum and all this stuff that's really bad for you. But at the same time, like, I think that I'm able to get the information that I would get out of a lithograph on these plates, but also to some other advantages as well. So yeah, that's how they're kind of produced. And there's a lot of other complexities in there as well, but call me over to be your visiting artist at your university.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. And I love the whole, like, being able to use light to process the plates. I was just curious, the one question I had is, are you able to go into them at all after that with like in a dry point or something. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can. The one thing with that is that you can't delete it though. So once you've exposed the image onto your plate, if you can't like change it then, if that's what the plate is, besides working additively. So you can't, I guess the things you can't work actively the plate anymore after that. So you could sit there and you can work with dry point over the top of it as well. And that's actually kind of interesting too, because the marks look slightly different when they're printed. So the marks that are exposed on there are going to have more of like a softer tone to them. They can still look heavy as far as with the amount of darkness that the imagery has. But if you're putting burrs into the plates by using like dry point tools, the line will look a little bit thicker. Interesting story about that. I had worked with Sergio Soav, who is one of the professors at OSU, and he had me work on some of the plates with him. And after I was done exposing some of the plates, he would take a engraving tool and go over them with an engraving tool, and would have this gorgeous engraved line on top of like the imagery that we had on the plates too. So they're versatile to a point. We'll put it that way. They're versatile to like a certain point. But yeah, you could draw back over top of them for sure.
Yeah, that's really exciting. Thank you. And so, okay, so back to this piece, these two prints specifically, before we go switching to any other images. Do you do your screen, the serigraphy before or after the intaglio printing?
I do it before the intaglio printing, mainly because I want the intaglio print to basically just kind of like go over the top of the imagery. So that way it's not getting blocked too much by the screen print. The other thing too is because the intaglio layers have an embossment to them, it's really difficult to pull a screen layer over the top of that without it being too. So in some ways, like it's beneficial because I'm able to get what I want out of it with the initial screen print beforehand and putting embossment over the top of it. But if I was going to do a lot of the screen print or serigraphy on top of it, the issue with that would be is I would have to avoid the embossment. And for something like this, I want them to go off the page. So it's a little different.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Thank you. So I'm personally interested in the appropriation of images in your work. You know, you're not taking images from like outside sources and appropriating, but you're appropriating images from your own work and repeating it. And so I'm curious, you know, where does the work begin? Such as, you know, smaller drawings that you make larger combinations, or are you making larger drawings and breaking them up to use in different places? You know, a little bit about your process.
Yeah, so for me, I typically will go through and all these like old books that have like a bunch of images from World War I in them and stuff that have a lot of like figures in strange precarious positions. It was such an interesting conflict because they had all these like weird tools that they were trying to modernize warfare with, and it looks rather silly sometimes. Like the guy with that big earpiece in the real world already left, like that's how they would listen to what's going on in the trenches on the other side, you know, and stuff. And some of those figures I think have this weird look about them. So I'll scan some of those and I'll start collaging them in Photoshop initially first, but I'll keep it loose too. So I keep those figures usually like floating in space and position them in a way that I started with the drawing from there. And then after that, I'll use that to kind of as a reference tool to start building up the image. So it starts in like with a loose Photoshop collage, and then I'm literally drawing and looking at it and building up off of it. But then from there, because I keep it flexible and don't add too much information, as I'm drawing, certain emotions or thoughts that I have about the piece, I'll add on to it then after the fact. So things like pills and bullets coming out of like a person's head and stuff, like those are all things that kind of get moved in after the fact because of the experience I'm having while I'm making the piece or something like that, or the thoughts that I'm having and that I want to connect to it. But the one thing I've been doing over the last, I want to say like 3 to 4 years though, is after I'm done, you know, making the image and printing the plate as the typical black and white edition or whatever I use for it, I then take those plates after the edition's done, and I usually print them onto sheets of like Kitakata paper or something like that. And I'm able then to take those sheets and start doing monotype layers on top of them, start doing other things to them, like hand drawing onto them in mixed media and things like that, to basically kind of give the plate a new life and start having other like mental conversations with it. to kind of maybe build up a new type of imagery there. And then from that, I then wrap them around a piece. Once they're completed, I then wrap them around a piece of wood, almost like they're like a painting on a small panel or something like that. And then they're able to kind of then exist as something that's still connected to the print that's, you know, that they're based off of, but then they kind of gain a new life of their own. And the other thing I like about that too is that my imagery has really evolved from doing that process, because then I'm able to go ahead and start considering other things about the space that when I go to make another image, I maybe wouldn't have been as reflective on if I just would have printed that plate and left it be, you know, like it gives me other ideas and other formations there. So like a lot of these like black swoops and stuff that are coming through some of these prints. In recent work, I've had this kind of like piece of like, I don't know what I get. Kind of like, I don't want to give it like too much of a descriptive thing, but it's like a piece of cloth that like runs through the imagery and is tying into figures and stuff. All that was kind of built on me, you know, adding these weird screen layers into some of these other side pieces that I was doing. And then from there, like it becomes something else than those prints. And then when I end up doing this process, the idea of mixed media on top of my other prints, who knows what that'll create and what that'll inform in a later piece too, you know? So in some ways it's like helpful because it gives me like another piece to add on to like, you know, what I've been creating. But in other ways it's helpful because it informs me personally more about what conceptually I'm trying to do with the imagery and kind of builds me up in a way. And I think another thing too about it, which this I think is something that's maybe closely linked to more printmakers than like painters or anybody else, is printmakers, we spend a lot of time producing plates and making images. And through that production, if we just keep it all into that box, it's really sometimes hard to think conceptually outside of that because you're working within the parameters of what you've created. And doing things like this, working mixed media like this, I think allows for more breakage of that then reinforms it. So it's kind of like that there.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love the objectness of the mixed media pieces on the panel.
Right.
You know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. I think it gives it a different weight. But at the same time, I think that I prefer them both equally, you know, but the paper has a look to it that I like, but then I'll see the panel pieces. But I'm not a painter either, too. Like I don't do paintings, but I think that this is the closest I get to it. And I think that also has a gravitas to it that I gain an understanding of as well. So yeah, I like the 3D physicality of it is good. And I'll probably branch upon that even more, like push those even further, hopefully in the next couple of years and seeing what that does with the prints.
You know, I'd love to hear major influences outside of, you know, music and the industrial age. In some of you've mentioned Otto Dix, Kathy Kollwitz, and Sukal, which I was not as familiar with. You know, just like who else? What other things are informing your work right now, and what's going on?
Yeah, so I mean, honestly, like to be making work about depressing stuff, like now's the time, you know, like a lot of ways, unfortunately. Yeah. So I mean, I think that, you know, I do spend a lot of time scrolling through news stuff and like looking at imagery from there, but very rarely that interacts its way into the work. But what I think another major influence for me personally is going over to VFW halls and going over to like areas in communities and stuff that are just kind of like typical Americana and like looking at the appearance of all of that, you know, and at the same time, I always have this like this feeling of this undercurrent of realities of what's actually going on in those scenarios. They have this perception of like this is, you know, kind of the typical like space for just, you know, what we as Americans would expect out of our social experiences, but at the same time, you know, there's a darkness to every side of that. So I think that I really kind of am intrigued of like walking through spaces like that, and I'm heavily influenced by a lot of that stuff. You know, smaller communities and smaller suburban communities too, I think have a lot of that as well. I currently live in Columbus, Ohio. So like Columbus is this weird space because it's a city, but at the same time, it still has a very small town vibe in certain areas as well. Like Worthington is an area in Columbus that my wife and I live rather close to, and that's very suburban looking. But it's still, you know, within like, you know, 10 minutes away from, you know, downtown Columbus. So I think that I like being able to like see some of those spaces and experience those, and that has an influence on the work, as far as this idea of, you know, kind of weird perceptions and stuff. So I guess the innocence of American society through the lens of what we expect it to be is, I think, in some ways like really influential to me. And especially now too, like with a lot of current images I'm working on too, like people will start noticing that as well. Another influence too right now that I'm trying to build up on, because while we do have all these very depressing things right now going on in society, I want to try to be able to pull out some bit of hope, you know, like from all of this that's going on. You know, we want to have something that, you know, to rely on, or something that, you know, we can, you know, fight for and stuff. So I think I've also been just searching for whatever that is, you know, in some ways. I have in one of my current pieces that's in the show that says something about they are enduring, you know, in some ways. And people that can make a difference are enduring. Like they're always there, always trying to strive for something, you know. And it's a long process, but we're always still trying. And I think that's something too that I try to find as a new influence and stuff, and trying to gauge from that. But yeah, but all things interest me as much as like super extreme things, you know. And I think those can collide together to create some really weird imagery and interesting stuff that influence my work.
Would you say that with what you're working on now, outside of these, that the hope is new?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I think also too, I've done so many shows of the last 2 years, especially, you know, as we've kind of come into the next stage of COVID, where people are, you know, going back to galleries again and stuff. And I think, and in some ways it's interesting, like I've gotten more opportunities to show post-COVID than, like, you know, or not post-COVID, but, you know, during COVID than we did, than I did when we were, you know, pre-pandemic. And I think because a lot of the work has relevance, you know, now, but I think at the same time, like when I go to those openings and stuff, people can talk about this brooding nature of everything, and like, oh man, you must be fun at dinner parties and stuff. And it's like, I'm a relatively fun guy, you know, but at the same time, I think that's why I think I'm trying to gravitate to that more, and that it's something becoming much more relatively new. And not that I'm going to make happy work by any means, but I think that I'm trying to start making slivers of alternatives. You know, I think that's probably a better way to say it. Of alternatives.
Yeah.
So
yeah, well, that's wonderful. Well, Michael, thank you so much. It has been my pleasure to talk to you today. And I mean, it has been wonderful to share your work with our Flint audience and our extended digital audience. So thank you so much for allowing us to do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Yeah. Right. Well, I just want to say thank you one more time to Michael Weigman for taking time out of his day to chat with us. It was really great listening to his different processes and influences. And I hope you enjoyed the conversation and then learned as much as I did. So thank you so much, and hope to see you around. Bye.